Woman!
Man!
Man, sorry. What knight lives in that castle over there?
I'm 37.
What?
I'm 37, I'm not old.
Well, I can't just call you man.
You could say Dennis.
I didn't know you were called Dennis.
Well, you didn't bother to find out, did you?
I did say sorry about the old woman, but from behind you looked...
What I object to is you automatically treat me like an inferior.
Well, I am king.
Oh, king, eh? Very nice. And how'd you get that, eh? By exploiting the workers. By hanging on to outdated imperialist dogma which perpetuates the economic and social differences in our society. If there's ever going to be any progress...
Dennis, there's some lovely filth down here. Oh, how'd you do?
How do you do, good lady? I am Arthur, King of the Britons. Whose castle is that?
King of the who?
The Britons.
Who are the Britons?
Well, we all are. We are all Britons. And I am your king.
I didn't know we had a king. I thought we were an autonomous collective.
You're fooling yourself. We're living in a dictatorship. A self-perpetuating autocracy in which the working classes...
Oh, there you go, bringing class into it again.
Well, that's what it's all about. If only people would
Please,
realise...
please, good people. I am in haste. Who lives in that castle?
No one lives there.
Then who is your lord?
We don't have a lord.
What?
I told you, we're an anarcho-syndicalist commune. We take it in turns to act as a sort of executive officer for the week.
Yes.
But all the decisions of that officer have to be ratified at a special bi-weekly meeting.
Yes, I see.
By a simple majority in the case of purely internal affairs.
Be quiet.
But by a two-thirds majority in the case of more
Be quiet. I order you to be quiet.
Order, who does he think he is?
I am your king.
Well, I didn't vote for you.
You don't vote for kings.
Well, how'd you become king then?
The Lady of the Lake, her arm clad in the purest shimmering samite, held aloft Excalibur from the bosom of the water, signifying by divine providence that I, Arthur, was to carry Excalibur. That is why I'm your king.
Listen, strange women lying in ponds distributing swords is no basis for a system of government. Supreme executive power derives from a mandate from the masses, not from some farcical aquatic ceremony.
Be quiet.
Oh, but you can't expect to wield supreme executive power just because some watery tart threw a sword at you.
Shut up.
I mean, if I went round saying I was an emperor, just because some moistened bint had lobbed a scimitar at me, they'd put me away.
Shut up. Will you shut up?
Ah, now we see the violence inherent in the system.
Shut up.
Oh, come and see the violence inherent in the system. Help, help, I'm being repressed.
Bloody peasant.
Oh, what a giveaway. Did you hear that? Did you hear that, eh? That's what I'm on about. Did you see him repressing me? You saw it, didn't you?
I was searching on a one-way street. I was hoping for a chance to meet.
All right, we're ready for week 2. I hope you guys are very excited to get going. Actually, I know no one really is. It's class. I know no one's really that excited. Hopefully, you guys are at least keeping up. Welcome to week 2, which is all about the foundations of democracy. This week is a building block after our first week. Our first week was more about the theories that influenced our government and our founding fathers. This week is more about what the founding fathers had seen that had come before and what things they wanted to take and use in their own system and what things seem to work and what things seem to not work anymore. What our founding fathers created was very unique and really had never been tried before, but there had been some governments who had tried something similar before, and some of them worked really well, some of them didn't at the time, and the founding fathers knew that there would be pitfalls, so they wanted to try to avoid those same issues that happened before. 3 different really principled democracies that had come before it, and they wanted to influence and use those influences on their own system that they were creating. The video that started it off was more of just a funny video that I happen to love. You know, it's from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. If you guys haven't seen that movie, another one that I would highly suggest. It's a classic. It is funny for me to see how the king reacted to a peasant, and I have a feeling that that's kind of how King George reacted to the Americans and using the ideas of freedom and what imperialism was. And the guy sounded very knowledgeable, and he was kind of talking to the king about human rights. And these are the same things that our founding fathers kind of talked about. He was a little more probably communist than anything else. It's hilarious just to watch the clip. And most of the clips will probably be like that in the class, that they're just funny, kind of and they might have something to say too, like the Dark Knight one that we had the week before. But this clip was just funny. It makes me laugh. While last week was about the theories behind democracy and what democracy could be, these were the actual actions that had taken place. And it's kind of weird to go backwards even more so than we went before, which is really just the earliest we went and talked about was the 15th century into the 16th century. This is even farther back into the BCs. When we're first discussing this, though, we need to discuss what actually democracy means. The first part of the word democracy is demos, which is Greek for people. Then followed by krasi, which is kratos, which means power. So it's literally means people, the power of the people. The system that the Greeks had come up with, and they were the first ones to really come up with this concept, or at least on record, of a society that had an actual structure with voting and had people who represented others in a larger society too. And we're going to talk a lot about the Athenian system and how Athens was that first ancient society to try something like this. And for the most part, and for most of human history, we have really had monarchies or some form of it. Pharaohs, emperors, kings, anything else too, which is just different types of monarchies. This was really the first one to try power for the people themselves. This is a system of government in which power is vested in the people, and there are many forms of democracy. There are two principal forms, are direct democracy and representative democracy. Democracies, almost all of them, have four different concepts that they all inherently have. One is individualism, and that's the idea that the individual has power and has rights. If that individual has freedoms, then there is a freedom to do what they feel like, then there is more growth, and that allows for the individual to have more power and give themselves power, and usually, hopefully, will create a more stable society since that person feels like they have individual power. The second one is liberty. So when somebody says that they're given liberty or that they're given freedoms to do what they feel like, that means that they are protected by their government to have some sort of freedom to travel, freedom of speech, to have liberties, to have... People don't like being trapped, encased, and that is a lot of how a lot of people felt in different types of government systems, but especially in democracies. This was a primary key point for democracies to provide that liberty for people. The next characteristic is equality, and equality can mean many different things. Everybody is on equal footing, that everybody has the same individual rights. Nobody has more rights than anybody else or less rights than anybody else. And equality is a really hard thing to achieve in any society. If it comes to race, if it comes to social class, if it comes to standing, having equal rights and equal equality amongst everybody. The problem is that it's not necessarily that there is equality, it's that they strive for equality. And if there is something that is not equal, there's an ability to try to change that. So that's really the definition of democracy. It's not necessarily that everybody has equality all the time, because sometimes they just can't, or they won't, because the system is just the way it is, or society is the way it is. But democracies strive for that equality, that there's at least that attempt to have equality. That's a really important factor in defining if there is a democracy, because we have our own issues in our country, obviously, with equality, and it's very present everywhere. The next one is fraternity, and that's really a brotherhood that's defined around a certain type of feeling or emotion. And that fraternity amongst everybody was that they bought into a system altogether, that this is for the greater good of everybody else, that this isn't about one individual or one person. This is about a whole group of people trying to make their society better. So that fraternity and that grouping makes the democracy stronger. That can really be fractured sometimes. We see it right now. There is a brotherhood around our identity as Americans, but we all define that very differently. The government's role in a democracy is really to enable individuals to reach their highest potential. It's not about trying to achieve the betterment of a monarchy or a monarchical family. It's about trying to achieve that for each individual person. This usually is defined under maximum liberty under the law, which means equality for all. This means also living in a just society, that society must be just and try to desire for justice for everybody, not just one individual or anything. It's about everybody in that collective society living under a just society. It's initially, in its first uses, was thought to be unmanageable. And a lot of that came because of lack of structure or different types or people kind of taking advantage of the system. But the doctrine itself of democracy was meant to be, at least they thought, unattainable because people were greedy and would try to undermine the system. The thing that they didn't really think about was, well, maybe we should make the system stronger and put checks and balances into place. And that's where our founding fathers kind of came in. How can we try to make this unmanageable doctrine manageable? This was really a big threat to monarchy and order because, under a monarchy, literally people have no rights. Everyone is working for the collective good of the monarchy. Say it was British royalty. They were working under and towards that goal of trying to attain some sort of status for the monarchs, not for the individual people. The biggest boost to democratic ideals were really the French and American revolutions. They were the first stepping stone towards things actually becoming attainable under these democratic principles. They were the first revolutions to have a democratic principle and try to overthrow, in France at least, overthrow an entire monarchy. And really, one of the biggest, if not the biggest monarchy in Europe at that point, or the Americans, which at least tried to overthrow or kick out the monarch from their own land. That is a huge step. In reading right now a lot about the Founding Fathers, that was scary. That was not, right now it seems like, oh yeah, like they knew what they were doing. They had no idea what was going to happen. And that was a really scary moment for the United States, at that point, the American colonies, because how were they supposed to define what they wanted? There was 13 individual countries at that point, not states, trying to come together. The democratic principles really weren't there, and people didn't really think that. They were all working for a monarch and living under a monarchical rule. So how can they make the society that was for the people? And really, they didn't know. The first attempt at a democracy was through Athenia and the Athens style of democracy. And that was between 1594 and 404 BC. So we're talking about almost 2,000 and a half years ago that this started. This democratic system was a popular democracy, which was a direct democracy. And direct democracies are very, very hard to control. That means that every single person gets a vote on every single law that is brought towards, so they get a vote on that. And this is really for small communities that this was happening. Athens was a small city, and they were attempting something that was different. It was unmanageable, at least for some people, to think, and part of that was because it was a direct democracy. People had a vote on everything. So imagine if every time a bill came through, we voted on it directly, not our representatives. That's a really hard system to keep in place. It'd almost be impossible today, and it was even impossible then. But the Athenian democracy really started to create certain ideas. The first one was the Agora, which was the center of commerce and politics. And this was the center of culture in Athens. It created a center for people to come talk and discuss ideas. It gave a central place for people, for their voices to be heard. That was a really important principle because nobody had really been able to talk about certain parts of their government. The Agora was one of those first human creations where people could discuss ideas and principles. And one of the key things that they created was called the Nix. And the Nix was a speaker's block for the people of Athens to discuss ideas. This is where, in the middle of this, the speaker's block was a way for people to come and tell their piece and say what they felt. It was inspirational for people to come speak their minds. This, at least, was the first sign of democratic ideas kind of creeping into a very large society. Athens was one of the largest cities in the world at this point and was a center for culture. And this began one of the key foundations called the Ecclesia, which was also translated to the Assembly. And this is formed by a poet and lawmaker in Greece called Solon. And Solon was really influential in making sure that people had some sort of political forum to come speak their minds. And not only that, but assemble and actually create an assembly together and a form of government where people could and had a structure around it. And all citizens gained the right to attend the Ecclesia, and it was a sovereign body to pass laws and decrees. It was the first sign of democracy really forming. It was something, at least, some foundation for people to come and not only speak their minds, but form laws and ideas. And the Ecclesia changed many times over the course of the almost 200 years that it was in formation. It changed over the years based on changing of tribes and groups of people. There's two key things that it also created. One was the idea of one man, one vote. That means anybody who was in the forum could have a vote towards whatever laws were put through. And again, this is only men who could vote. It was also unicameral, meaning that there wasn't a second body to go check the other body. And this is really important. We're going to talk about the three key differences in some different types of democracies. Most democracies now, including our own, have a bicameral legislation. This was a unicameral, meaning that there was one form. We have two, the House and the Senate, and many other democracies around the world have two. Some have three, and that's a tricameral. Athenian democracy really came to an end, though, once Macedonia came in, and there was a whole thing with Greece has just a whole history of being conquered or taking over other people. So it's hard to really keep track. Macedonians came in and it failed, and they created their own system and brought in somebody to rule over Athens, and it was basically done as an experiment for Athenian democracy. But it was an important first step, and it should be acknowledged as really the first try, some sort of system that had a actual functioning foundation to build off of. The second important democratic system that we can talk about is the Roman Republic. And the Roman Republic was kind of the first one that actually really took an entire empire and ran off of a democratic system. It really lasted between 509 BC to 559 BC. This was really, it fell due to the rise of Caesar. Once Caesar came into power, the Roman Republic was gone. And partly because they gave Caesar a lot of power, and Caesar just said, well, I don't need them anymore. I have all the power I need. So, basically the Roman Republic can die. The Empire of Rome had a long established history of for emperors and single rulers. The system of government in Rome was a little bit different than that in Athens. It actually had more of a structure. And one of those important things that we took from was the bicameral legislation, like what I talked about earlier. The biggest difference that it had was two consuls. And that was basically two glorified presidents. And they shared power and were able to veto each other, and had veto power below. Again, we're starting to see two similar ideas that we use today. One is veto powers, and two is a powerful executive overlooking the entire laws of the body that came below it. So these two counselors were ahead of the other two bicameral legislative powers. And they ran government. They directed the army as well. They acted as judges also, so there wasn't a separate judicial branch that they had. There was an actual judge who was overlooking. They were actual judges too. In emergency, they can grant dictator powers to one person. And one of the most famous one was Caesar. And Caesar ended up taking power and cutting out over the counselors too. But this was mostly in times of war, a very serious war. The Roman bicameral Congress also had two separate branches. One was the Senate, which was more of the elites in the society who already got to have more power. They were the second tier below the counselors. And the second one was the assembly. And the assembly was also important. That was the democratically elected people that were representative of other people. So they had not a direct democracy like the Athenian side of government, but they had representative people who came in and represented the will of the people. The Roman Republic also had its own form of the agora, where they called the forum, and that was the marketplace and center for all of Roman life and culture. While there was still a hierarchy in Roman society, giving the power to the Senate, especially to the more ecclesiastic side of the society, there was still a place for common people to come and have their own interpretations of what was going on. The Romans also had a forum for people to come speak their mind called the rostra, just like the Greeks had the nix. It was giving power and letting one man speak and have his say. And again, another place where people could come and form their opinions. Some other key elements of the Roman Republic, though, one was called two censors. They could demote senators or praetors, which were the assemblymen. And they could demote them. They could kick them out of the council, the assembly, or the Senate if they felt that they weren't voting the correct way. Another one was the tribunes, which had veto against each other, and the praetors. So there was a whole complicated system and web of the way that the Roman Republic worked. The way that I really care about and what you guys know is that there was the Senate and the assembly. And armed gangs were part of their democratic system, which meant that people were kind of forced to vote the right way. They were kind of like, hey, you should vote this way on this certain bill that we have. It was kind of a way for the counselors or for the Senate and the assembly to kind of keep power and make sure votes went a certain way. After the fall of the Roman Republic, we really don't see much of democracy or any form of democratic system. There's some things here and there, but really these were the two biggest ancient forms of democracy. The last key formative government we're going to talk about is the Westminster Republic. which is the United Kingdom, and the ability to balance both a monarchy and a parliament too. When the Magna Carta was written in 1215, it was a statement of popular rights and limits to the kings. That it was the first initial reaction to basically the pre-Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence takes a lot of its statements from the Magna Carta itself and expands on them. It was the first time that really the king's power had been limited, and they accepted it as a way to give people certain unalienable rights and civil liberties, and that was a really important first step. When Britain created its own church, it started and overturned the papacy. It kind of created and started this whole revolution where they kicked out the Catholic Church and created their own. While it was done for reasons that maybe weren't the greatest, King Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife, and the Catholic Church wouldn't allow him, so he was like, well, screw you, we're done, and you're out of our country, and created his own church, which is the Anglican Church. It wasn't just because he wanted to divorce his wife. There were other reasons, and I think Henry wanted to have his own authority around this, but him and Thomas More were the first people to create an actual place for Parliament, which still stands to this day. It used to be a palace for the royals, one of their palaces, but now it is used still to this day as the house for the people and for the government. Over the course of Parliament's time, though, and up until the Revolution especially, it was nothing really more than just a representative of nobles and royals. It wasn't really a full democratic system like we see today in the United Kingdom, and they have a very different system, similar but different system than we do, and different types of voting. To still make the argument that sometimes it's the Senate, at least the House of Lords in the British system, is really just nobles and royals, and they don't have as much power as our Senate does. It's more of the people that have more power, and the House of Commons that has more power in the British Parliament, and there's reasons for that we won't get into. It really was just for the royals and their nobles and prerogatives for them, and it wasn't really about the people. So system of government that created, which was also a bicameral legislation of all the different types of legislation systems that we see, we are most related to the United Kingdom and their system. The one difference really being the judiciary at that point was really attached to the king still and really followed what the king said. So there was really just two branches of government. That was the monarchy with the judges below them, and then there was the people and Parliament. It was harder for people to really get common good out of Parliament up until many years after the American Revolution, where they slowly began to strip the power of the monarchy. It is so closely related. Our founding fathers took a lot of influence from that government system, and they lived under it. So they knew that there were good parts about it, but there were certain things that they didn't like about it, and so took certain aspects of it and then made their own system out of it. Now that we've talked about these three different types of foundations for democracy, now we can start talking about our own. And a lot of what came out of the revolution stemmed from the identity that America had at its very founding. The first founding in the country, the first settlement in the country, was in 1607 in Jamestown. And Jamestown was the first initial colony to be put out into the New World, and for Britain to kind of put its stamp on North America. There was a colonial agreement between the king and the colonials who would arrange for them to set up settlements around North America. One of the key transitions, though, was the first initial settlement that wasn't necessarily given permission by the United Kingdom, and that was the Mayflower. The Mayflower came over in 1620. An important part of the Mayflower was the Mayflower Compact, which was the first kind of document on North American soil that explained the ideas of freedom and rights, and it was an agreement amongst all the men and grown men on the Mayflower, but it was the first compact and agreement that was made to kind of create this new society that was free to express their religious identity. These were many religious people who felt they were persecuted in the United Kingdom and decided to create their own world in the United States. And it was kind of an initial step towards being more independent, and really gave kind of an identity to America after that point, and to who the colonies would be, that they wanted to come to this new land where they were far away from the United Kingdom. It was a tiny island across the sea that had a lot of power in terms of money and armies and navies, but it had this firm independent identity that Americans began to hone in on over the course of the next 100 and 150 years, that they started to establish themselves in North America. There's this firm American identity that was very different from the other colonies. And Parliament's role in the colonies was really to keep track and tax the people, but the Americans didn't really have any representation in Parliament. They didn't have anything. This cost of the empire on the United Kingdom really fell to the colonies, and when the French-Indian War happened, this was a big step towards the United Kingdom being like, well, we fought a war on North American soil, and we brought soldiers to the French-Indian War and tried to protect you. You now need to pay for that in different forms of taxes. That was fine for some American citizens, but they also weren't happy that they were taxed that much and felt that that was wrong, especially when they didn't have representation in Parliament. And that was the big key, was they felt that they were English citizens, but weren't given the rights of English citizens, that they weren't given the representation in Parliament that they had been asked for or been given, and given inalienable rights in Congress. And while I think people make fun of the fact that we went to war over taxes, it's true in the way, but it's more about the fact that we didn't have representation. If the English Parliament had given representation to the American citizens, it would have made a big difference. Probably would not have had a revolution, honestly. We probably would have stayed with England, at least for a couple more years. We probably would have been able to, because there were many founding fathers who did not want to leave the British Empire. They wanted to be, they felt themselves, they were Englishmen. That was a big issue for the colonists, that they just felt like they were put off to the side, that they weren't given those rights. So what do? They decide, hey, now is the time where we need to really form our own rights and say what we believe. And that's where the Declaration of Independence came in. And this week I'm going to show you some clips from, at least it was a good interpretation of the forming of the Declaration of Independence and how and what the colonies had to fight for to get this resolved. It was a very contentious issue. And it was by no means unanimous that they were going to leave the United Kingdom or Britain. There was many colonies that wanted to stay, that wanted to try to figure something out. It turned out that they were not going to be given those rights. And when they looked at each other, they said, we now need to do something. What can we do? And they formed the Declaration of Independence, which was written by Thomas Jefferson. And we're going to go over it in just a little bit. So the Revolutionary War starts happening. The first thing that they try to do, or one of the first things that the Americans do, is form an alliance with France. And France really probably would take this one back, I think. And not for the reasons that you would think. The reason why the French helped us in the Revolutionary War and were our biggest allies, basically our only allies against the British, was to kind of stick it to the British. And that is the truth. We would not have won that war without France, especially when it came to naval units and soldiers, supplies, food, anything too. We did not have any sort of ability to maintain our country without the help of France. And Lafayette is one of the key founding fathers. He's the French founding father in America, and he was one of the first people to kind of really push the French monarchy to support the Americans, and it was just singularly because they wanted to stick it to the British. And thought it'd be hilarious to see if the British would fight against their own and would lose too. It'd be humiliating for the British because the French and the British, obviously, even still to this day, but definitely back then, hated each other. This was really the first time that the French had helped. It ended up being their demise in the end. They had really created this system, and French people had seen the Americans fight and win, and then they were like, well, we want to overtake our own monarchy. And the French monarchies kind of looked like, well, wait, what? They didn't really think through the ideas that maybe people were starting to think about having more freedoms and individuality. And at this point, as I said in last week too, they were an absolute monarchy, and they did not put up with any insurrection and did not really grant rights to French citizens. And it's probably why they chopped off King Louis's head a couple years after the American Revolution. And there's many things to go into that backstory too, about how the Americans reacted to the French Revolution and how they were kind of scared by it, honestly. And there were many founding fathers who were for it, and there were many founding fathers who were against that French Revolution. Interesting enough, the Americans had really formed this solid alliance with France and the French monarchy. And then all of a sudden, the French democracy really took hold, and the French Revolution took hold, and they didn't have an alliance anymore. They didn't have a strong alliance with France. After that point, it's kind of fraught a little bit. But during this time, as the American Revolution is going on, they have one form of government government. That's called the Articles of Confederation, which we are going to talk about next week. But the Articles of Confederation, in just a brief summary, was extremely weak. It did not give power to an executive branch. People were scared to give power to the executive, to any form of branch that would be considered almost a monarchy or slightly that way. Each individual state in all the colonies really viewed themselves as individual nations. They weren't the United States that we think of today. They were extremely divided. We're not really into the fact that they were going to give up sovereignty in order to create this one central government. But what started to change this was, slowly but surely, many of the founding fathers saw the weaknesses in the Articles of Confederation. George Washington was one of those especially. Washington believed, when he was a general in the Revolutionary War, there needed to be a stronger government. The United States government could not pay for a standing army, could not feed their soldiers, could not give them guns, weapons. They were lucky to have won, and Washington knew this. And he knew how central it was to have a stronger government going into the next part. There were many rebellions, too. They couldn't pay their soldiers, feed their soldiers. So soldiers started to riot, started to go into the streets, almost took over the Capitol in Philadelphia at many points, almost overthrew the entire Articles of Confederation. And so the founding fathers saw this, and one of those was Shays' Rebellion, which was probably almost the most successful, where they almost overtook almost overthrew the Confederation. It was really a scary time because it could have torn the entire country apart. And the founding fathers looked around and said, okay, well, now we need to put together something else. At first they came to the Constitutional Convention looking to just trying to fix the Articles of Confederation and not try to fully replace it. And then once they got there, at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, they said, yeah, we're going to need to do something different. I don't know what it is, but this just isn't working. We got to cut the whole thing out and replace it. And that's where we come up with the Constitution today. It was not a simple thing. Next week, I will talk more about the Constitution, but this is where we have our actual foundation of government. And this is where it came from, was these central ideas, which, again, I'll talk about next week, but the balance between a powerful government and the rights of the people. And again, something that our philosophers talked about last week, and something we're going to talk about next week especially. American democracy didn't just come out of nowhere. It has and took that Greek and Greco-Roman heritage, those ideas and those principles that had gone before it, and said, okay, what worked and didn't work. Part of that, and what they took too, was they loved the British representative democracy. They thought that was the most effective form of government, is what they'd grown up with, but they felt that there were some tweaks that needed to be made. And the colonists modeled it after the British system. It was a great transition from the British system into their own. They wanted a representative democracy. They wanted representatives in parliament. They did not think a direct democracy would work, for good reason, because, the Athenian democracy worked, but didn't work. And the Roman one worked in some ways, but there was a lot of different back and forth and ability to kind of undermine certain branches while give too much power to the other ones. And on top of that, too, had the ability to authorize a dictator, which is not what they wanted. Parliament was designed to create legislative bodies, make laws, and then send to the king for the approval. And the king and Parliament began to reject American legislative initiatives and no representation, and they really didn't care. As the formation of their government began to take place, they tried to look at the things that had come before it, including from the times of the Enlightenment. And they took the ideas of science and religion and said, okay, we want a separation of church and state. We want a powerful executive. We want a Bill of Rights for the people that says, it gives rights to the individuals in our society. Locke's second treatise on government versus Hobbes's Leviathan was an important stepping stone in creating this government. That central idea led to Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. And Thomas Jefferson writing the Declaration of Independence, you see his certain rights that Locke had laid out. Jefferson laid out his own. And he took a couple of different steps with the Declaration of Independence in order to write it and create this really important democratic principle. One, he took from intellectual history. So he used a lot of 4 different types of history: natural history, religious history, the Reformation, and the Enlightenment. From natural history, he used the doctrine that human affairs should be governed by certain ethical principles, which is reason. Not just because somebody says something is the way it is, it should be reasoned and thought out and well thought out. The second one was religious history. The religious history gave rise to Christianity, which was good and gave some sort of level to the idea of taking care of the poor, the sick, the downtrodden, and creating a community. But the wealth and opulence of the church also had kind of created a very corrupt society too. So Jefferson really believed in a separation of that church and state, and that's kind of where his principles come from in the Declaration of Independence, too. The Reformation is another one. The idea that man could communicate with God without an intermediary, which included the clergy and priests. That man had the right to talk to God directly and not use a priest as the leader to talk to God. And that was a really important step to understanding human beings having a right, a divine right of individuality. And last was the Enlightenment, what we talked a lot about last week. And it was an extension of the Renaissance. And it was in man deciding his own destiny and not allowing it to some divine right. Man having a say in what he wanted to do and giving that power back to individuals. The most famous line to come from the Declaration of Independence was obviously the preamble. And this is one that many people probably will know, but I'll read it just straight away. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with a certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And this is taken directly from Locke. Locke said, reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind who would but consult it, that there all be all equal and independent. No one ought to harm one another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. Life, liberty, and property were an essential part, but they changed it to happiness to even expand on that idea more. A man is allowed to enjoy life and life's purposes, not just through property. And I think actually at one point they said there was at least some idea that they would use just the direct quote that life, liberty, and possessions are property, quote, in the Declaration of Independence, but it was changed to happiness. It is even more expansive in terms of man be able to define his own destiny around that. There were 24 complaints in all in the Declaration of Independence, and the four main parts that they complained about were the legislative, the judicial, the taxation, and occupation. The complaints were that laws were not passed, legislatures' wills were ignored, and popular representation was disregarded, and they didn't have any power. Anytime the colonies would bring forward a law, they weren't passed and they weren't discussed. Legislatures' wills were ignored, so if they wanted something in their own states, in their own legislatures, those laws were ignored that were created by the colonists themselves. They were disregarding any sort of popular representation in Parliament for these people who considered themselves British citizens. So they were saying and sitting there going, if you just gave us representation, they'd almost be, I don't think they'd be willing to pay taxes, but they at least would maybe at least have that representation. There'd be plenty of people who would be like, well, our representatives represented us and we still are paying this much tax. But not having that representation was really important to the founding fathers deciding, and to everybody who was writing or voting on the Declaration of Independence, to put forward their own belief in that. The other complaints were the judicial complaints, and one of them was judicial officers and judges were controlled by the king. People were not really given due process, there was no real justice for them, and there was a double standard for British troops over Americans or American citizens. And one of the key issues that came up was the Boston Massacre, which really was kind of propagandized more in the colonies. The Boston Massacre occurred right before the Revolution, was a catalyst for colonists really feeling like there was a tyranny involved with the British monarchs. It was these Bostonians really trying to poke the British soldiers, and the British soldiers defended themselves and shot them. And then they were brought to trial for murder charges. And John Adams, who was the vice president, one of the founding fathers, the first vice president of the United States, the second president of the United States, was their lawyer. And he stood up for these British soldiers who were defending themselves, and he felt that they weren't given he wanted to give them a fair trial and fair representation. That same double standard was not given for American citizens, and they were worried that American citizens would be given even more harsher punishments in Britain, and there was no judiciary to kind of give them a fair trial. The next one was taxation, and this is a fairly simple one. They didn't have any representation in legislature, so if there's no taxation, no representation. That is standard. That if you're not going to give us representation, we are not citizens, and therefore we should not be taxed anything. You can make some arguments with it, but that was a very firm belief that the founding fathers had, that they needed to have that representation. And the last one was occupation. And a lot of this came from the fact that British soldiers could basically do whatever they felt like in the colonies. And one of the things that the colonists felt was that British soldiers took advantage of them. They would stay in their houses for long periods of time. And we'll talk about that in the coming weeks on the Bill of Rights. There was a certain right in there that really doesn't make much sense anymore, but was important at the time of the Revolution too. Soldiers were allowed to do whatever they wanted. They were pressed into service to oppress the colonists, and there was this mentality that they were taking over an area and that they were oppressing the citizens around them. And really, you have to remember that these people felt that they were British citizens, that they were not colonists necessarily, or that they weren't any less than citizens. They felt they were British citizens and did not understand why there was this mentality of like this siege and this weird dynamic between the British soldiers and the colonists, that they needed to be controlled and they were unruly. That was a big distinction for the founding fathers. That made a huge difference in how they felt that this was not about them being a part of the British Empire. This was being subjugated to the British. And for the concluding part of the Declaration of Independence, it says, we've warned them. We've reminded them of the circumstances of immigrating here and why we immigrated here. We've appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we've tried as best as we could to actually put that out. They put out an olive branch petition saying, look, we want this to end. We don't want this to go to war, but we feel that this is important. This is the first step that we need in order to make sure that we are protected as British citizens, and the British rejected them. And after that point, they had no choice but to move forward. In forming the Declaration of Independence, this was a formation of not only that the American people had right, but that they had a right beyond just the British British government. It's not only become a statement on government, but it's also become a statement on individuality and freedom. It's one of the singular best documents that has ever been written, and probably almost, you can make an argument, one of the most important beyond the Bible. And that is singularly because it talks about individuality and government and many other things that people believed at this point, and it's the culmination of almost 400 years of Enlightenment thinking and using the ideas and principles of the Enlightenment. And this is the first action that was actually taken and put forward as a way to define human rights and liberties. So now we've put all this together. This is now the first step of using the philosophy that we learned last week and the systems that we've learned from this week. This is the first step in creating a government that is based around these principles. And from that point, what we're going to talk about next week is after the revolution, what happens? Like, how does the Constitution come into effect? We're talking about the Articles of Confederation. The fighting to get the Constitution just to be accepted was a huge fight with our founding fathers. And it's a really interesting portion of our history. I'm really interested to see how you guys like it. We're going to go through different parts of the Constitution. It sounds like a slog because it is, but at least it will give you guys an idea of what we're looking at. And hopefully it will give you more perspective on how our government actually works and the balances that our founding fathers put in order to make sure that things were certain protect, why they put in certain things the way they did in order to protect formation of the government that they wanted to create, which is a constitutional republic. That is it for week 2. I hope you guys have enjoyed this. If you have any questions, please let me know. I can at least go into more detail on our message boards. Hopefully you guys will at least be able to do more research too. Make sure you're looking at the assignments I posted for this week, that they have more detail about exactly what happened during the formation of the Declaration of Independence and even leading up to that point. If you have any concerns, let me know. Again, I'm always open. I look forward to seeing you guys next week for talking about the Constitution, and hopefully it will be interesting and fun to talk about. Thanks, guys. See you next week.